This isn't a story about one country having a rough summer. Right now, heat records are falling across multiple continents at once, and in a growing number of places, that heat has already tipped over into something more serious. Real, officially declared drought. The World Meteorological Organization said just over a week ago that record-breaking heat and extreme weather are continuing worldwide, and I don't think that's an exaggeration for effect. I want to walk you through what's actually happening across Europe, Africa, the Americas, and back home in the US, what's tying so much of it together, and why heat and drought aren't really two separate stories. They're two stages of the exact same process. Let's get into it. Europe is the clearest, most advanced example of this pattern, so let's start there. The continent has been dealing with worsening drought since early spring, building on lower than normal rainfall and higher than average temperatures that turned into direct fuel for genuinely destructive wildfires across France and Spain back in July. By early August, burned area across the European Union was already running ahead of where it stood at the same point in 2025. And 2025 itself was already the worst year on record for burned area in the EU. River flow forecasts from the Copernicus European Flood Awareness System are showing low to extremely low discharge levels through catchments in France, the Alpine region, and Eastern Europe. The combined drought indicator, the tool European monitoring agencies use to formally track this, has alert level conditions currently sitting across southeastern UK, France, southern Germany, northern Italy, with additional spots showing up in the Iberian Peninsula, Belarus, and Poland. This hasn't been a single heat wave passing through either. The UK and France were bracing for another heat wave in mid-August, arriving on the heels of a new temperature record that had just been set for the region, and forecasters have described the pattern as slowly shifting eastward through the month, expanding activity into the Balkans and the western Black Sea region rather than simply fading out. It's worth explaining what's actually driving this, because it's a good example of how genuinely distant patterns in the ocean can reorganize weather thousands of miles away. This summer's setup involves a strengthening El Niño, a periodic warming of surface waters in the tropical Pacific that reliably shifts weather patterns across large parts of the globe, combined with something called the North Atlantic Wormhole, a patch of unusually cool surface water that tends to develop south of Greenland. Despite its name describing cooler water, the cold patch actually helps reinforce a persistent zone of high pressure over Europe by altering the position of the jet stream, and this year that effect has been reinforced further by marine heat waves sitting in the Mediterranean and Norwegian seas, essentially unusually warm patches of ocean adding extra heat and moisture into the same atmospheric pattern. Layer a moderate to strong positive Indian Ocean dipole on top of that, another distant ocean temperature pattern known to influence global weather, and you get a mutually reinforcing setup that's kept high pressure, heat, and dryness parked over Europe for months rather than days. Now let's go to East Africa, because this region shows the heat to drought progression this video's title is actually describing, already having played out in real time. Severe rainfall deficits over the past 90 days have been significant enough that monitoring agencies formally upgraded conditions to an official designation of drought across southern South Sudan and parts of northern, eastern, and central Ethiopia. I want to flag that word drought carefully here, because it's not just a description of dry weather, it's a specific technical classification based on measured rainfall running meaningfully below historical baselines over a sustained period. Getting formally upgraded to that designation means monitoring agencies have data confirming this has moved past ordinary dry weather into a genuine, measurable deficit with real consequences for agriculture and water supply. Interestingly, not every part of the region is dealing with the same problem at the same time. The Sud wetlands in south. Sudan are still dealing with ongoing inundation, meaning flooding, even as drought conditions expand elsewhere in the same country, a good reminder that the region rarely means uniform conditions everywhere within it. Central America and northern South America are showing a similar, still developing story. Dryness has been worsening across Central America and Venezuela, with abnormal dryness persisting and expanding across northern Colombia and northwestern Venezuela, and pushing further into southeastern Colombia and central Venezuela as well. Much above average temperatures have been observed specifically in northern Colombia. This isn't a uniformly worsening picture, though, and I think the nuance matters. Forecasters were expecting heavy rainfall in parts of western Colombia and moderate rainfall across central and eastern Colombia in the coming week, which actually raises flood risk in some of those same western areas, even as drought concerns persist elsewhere in the country. Meanwhile, rainfall is expected to stay suppressed below average, specifically in eastern Venezuela and northwestern Colombia. It's a genuinely mixed picture, with drought expanding in some spots while flood risk rises in others nearby, which is a more accurate description of how these patterns actually unfold than a single, simple, everywhere is drying out headline would suggest. Central Asia has its own version of this story too, with hot conditions and high, above normal maximum temperatures currently affecting western Kazakhstan and Pakistan, part of a broader band of abnormal heat that current global outlooks describe as stretching across western and eastern Africa, Central Asia, Hispaniola, Central America, and northern South America, more or less simultaneously. And of course, there's the United States, which I've covered extensively on this channel already this summer. The northwest and north central U.S. have remained a persistently hot, dry zone since July, feeding directly into the wildfire season I've been tracking in detail, including some of the largest active fires anywhere in the country right now. The southeast's drought region has continued seeing anomalous heat and dryness on top of an already dry pattern. And looking at the most recent outlook, Texas specifically is favored for below normal rainfall over the coming week, layered on top of temperatures likely running well above normal across much of the continental U.S., with the West Coast and the stretch from the eastern Great Lakes into the mid-Atlantic as the main exceptions. Given how dry Texas has already been running, the combination of continued heat and continued rainfall deficit is exactly the kind of setup that tends to deepen an existing drought rather than offer any real relief. I want to explain the actual mechanism connecting heat and drought, because it's not just that hot weather and dry weather happen to show up together. There's a direct physical relationship between them. Higher temperatures dramatically increase evapotranspiration, the combined process of water evaporating directly from soil and being released by plants through their leaves. Even in a region that hasn't seen a dramatic drop in rainfall, sustained extreme heat alone can pull soil moisture down rapidly just through that increased evaporation. When reduced rainfall and elevated heat show up together, which is exactly what's happening across Europe, parts of the Americas, and the U.S. southeast and northwest right now, that effect compounds quickly. And once soil dries out, enough. It creates its own feedback loop. Dry ground absorbs and radiates heat differently than moist ground, reflecting less of the sun's energy into evaporating water and instead pushing more of it directly into warming the air right above the surface, which drives daytime temperatures up even further and dries the ground out even more. That's the same feedback loop I've described in earlier videos covering U.S. heat domes, just now playing out simultaneously across multiple continents rather than one region. The practical stakes behind all of this are genuinely significant, and they go well beyond just uncomfortable weather. Reduced river flow directly threatens hydropower generation, since less water moving through a dam means less electricity generated right at the moment air conditioning demand for electricity is at its highest. Low river levels also constrain the cooling systems that thermal and nuclear power plants rely on, since many of them draw river water specifically to cool their systems, a real documented problem during Europe's severe 22.2 drought that's resurfacing again this year. Agriculture takes a direct hit from both reduced water availability and heat stress on crops and livestock. Transportation suffers too, since low river levels can restrict the barge traffic that moves a meaningful share of European freight along major rivers. And tourism, a significant part of the economy across the Mediterranean and Balkans, specifically, faces its own disruption from extreme heat warnings and, increasingly, wildfire risk during a peak summer travel season. There's also a direct human health dimension to sustained heat like this that's worth taking seriously on its own, separate from the drought and infrastructure angle. Prolonged heat exposure is particularly dangerous for older adults who have a reduced physiological capacity to regulate body temperature compared to younger people, along with anyone with pre-existing cardiovascular or respiratory conditions. Researchers studying global heat exposure have specifically flagged aging populations as an area of growing concern precisely because so many of the regions dealing with repeated, sustained heat waves, including large parts of Europe, also have older median populations than much of the rest of the world. Prolonged heat isn't just an agricultural or infrastructure story. It's a direct public health story too, and the same repeated heat wave pattern hitting Europe throughout this summer is exactly the kind of sustained exposure that tends to show up in excess mortality statistics well after the fact, even when any single day doesn't feel record-breaking on its own. I want to be careful not to flatten this into a single, simple global narrative, though, because the honest picture is more textured than the whole planet is drying out at once. Europe is the furthest along in this progression, already dealing with both severe heat and expanding measurable drought simultaneously. East Africa has recently crossed the same threshold, moving from abnormal dryness into an official drought designation in specific areas. Central America, Venezuela, and parts of Colombia are still in the earlier worsening dryness stage, with real regional variation, including nearby areas actually facing elevated flood risk from incoming rain at the very same time. And the U.S. picture is genuinely mixed too, with some regions like the Northwest and Southeast deepening an existing dry pattern while other parts of the country are actually favored for above normal rainfall over the same period. Painting this as one uniform global catastrophe would actually undersell the real specific stories playing out differently in each of these places, and I'd rather give you the more accurate, regionally detailed picture than a single dramatic headline. If you want to actually track how this develops, a few sources are worth bookmarking directly rather than waiting for headlines to summarize them. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center publishes regular international hazard outlooks covering exactly this kind of global heat and drought pattern. The Copernicus European Drought Observatory tracks Europe's specific situation in detail, including that combined drought indicator I mentioned earlier. And drought.gov aggregates US-specific outlooks if you want to check conditions closer to home. None of these require any special expertise to read, and checking them directly gives you a much more precise current picture than waiting for the next dramatic headline to summarize months of gradually building conditions into one attention-grabbing sentence. I'll be tracking how each of these regional stories develops over the coming weeks, particularly whether East Africa's newly designated drought areas expand further, whether Europe's heatwave pattern continues its eastward drift into the Black Sea region, and whether Central America and Venezuela's worsening dryness crosses into a formal drought designation the way East Africa's already has. If any of these regional pictures shift meaningfully, I'll bring you an update. Stay informed, check the actual outlooks for wherever you live rather than assuming, and I'll see you in the next one.